Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of negotiations, accountability, law, and diplomacy in peace processes. Join us as we dive into discussions with individuals who have played key roles as diplomats, lawyers, and advocates in negotiating peace and justice. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. I am so honored today to be joined by our guest, Ambassador Yvette Stevens. She has a distinguished career spanning engineering, diplomacy, and humanitarian leadership. Ambassador Stevens began her career breaking barriers as Sierra Leone's first female engineer before she transitioned to a distinguished career at the United Nations, where she was responsible for analyzing and engaging on refugee crises in over 30 countries, and where she led pivotal humanitarian initiatives. Ambassador Stevens has represented Sierra Leone at the UN Human Rights Council and has served as Sierra Leone's ambassador to Switzerland, as well as the permanent representative to the United Nations and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Ambassador Stevens is currently executive in residence at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, where her work focuses on human rights, African development, energy, national security, and climate change. Ambassador Stevens, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, today we're going to talk about the conflict in Sierra Leone and the efforts to resolve the conflict through the Abidjan talks, the Lomé Accords, and then the creation of a war crimes tribunal after the failure of the Lomé Accords. But can you kick us off with some basics about the Sierra Leone Civil War so that our audience has a foundational understanding?
Well, I will start with myself. I was evaluation officer in UNHCR, and in 1990, I was on an evaluation mission to Sierra Leone to look at the plight of refugees, Liberian refugees that had fled to Sierra Leone. I remember standing at the border between these countries are so fragile, because on one side of the border, in fact, relatives were divided between countries. And sometimes the border was just a stream across the river. And I remember sitting looking across the river and saying, I wonder why this war hasn't come to Sierra Leone, because it was also easy. But then also, as part of the evaluation, I was to go and visit parts of areas of origin in Liberia. So I needed approval for that from the warlord who was in charge of those areas, and Charles Taylor. And so a request was sent by UNHCR to say that we are sending this evaluation mission to talk to people. And there was a flat refusal. He did not want any Sierra Leonean to come to his area because he had blamed Sierra Leone for harboring the base for ECOMOG forces that were fighting in Liberia they launched from the Sierra Leone airport. And in fact, in later that year, indeed in a BBC broadcast, he did say that by harboring the base for ECOMOG at the Sierra Leone airport, Sierra Leone had become a legitimate target in his war in Liberia. It came as no surprise when in March of 1991, there was this incursion into Sierra Leone. And in April 1991, a communique was issued by Fode Sanko, who proclaimed himself head of the Revolutionary United Front, that, in his own words, they are going to fight against the illegitimate one-party system in Sierra Leone, and they were aiming to fight against corruption and poverty. But and he claimed that their objective was to overthrow the then government, which was led by President Momo, and make sure that they would address corruption and poverty. But one thing which I found very strange is because their signature, what they did was they entered the rural areas and then they were killing people, indoctrinating them, amputating them. And to me, it didn't make sense. Like if you set out to eliminate poverty, you are chopping the hands and limbs of the poor people. What sense does that make? So always when in the UN, I used to attend some meetings, even though I was not directly involved. And every time I would say, he can claim to be addressing the needs of the poor by chopping off their hands. And I remember that, because basically he had some sympathy, and I think from the international community, which I resented at the time. And I was pacified as being somebody taking sides with the government of the day, but the point was that because he claimed that he was going to fight against the one-party system, somehow, even though he was committing all these atrocities, he had the sympathy from some parts of the international community. And really, it was very interesting that this went on for years, actually, whereas he was fighting. And it was only later, when the RUF, when it was discovered that the diamonds that were being sold through Liberia in the international market had originated from Sierra Leone, and he had concentrated, in this is fight against poverty and corruption, he had concentrated on the diamond mining areas. So then there was suspicion as to his motive, but still he carried on. And by then he had the support, of course, of Charles Taylor, because they had trained together in Libya. And he was, in fact, he himself was in Liberia fighting with Charles Taylor before the incursion into Sierra Leone. So he had the full support of Charles Taylor. And he had not only the support, but also not only the initial support, but continued support. Now, the president of the day, Momo, turned for help to the UK at the time, and he was refused. He was rejected by the Department of Defense in the UK. As I said, there was some sympathy. You have a one-party corrupt government, so there was not much sympathy for him. He had to revert to an arrangement with the Guinean government. There was a pact that was signed in the 70s on mutual cooperation to address any military uprising. And the Guinean troops came and temporarily held back the advance of the RUF. However, this war lasted, as we all know now. It lasted from 1991 to 2002. The period was characterized by 3 coups d'etat, deposition of the elected president and sending him into exile twice, 2 peace accords, abductions, support from international forces from both sides before peace was eventually declared in 2002.
Well, Ambassador Stevens, let's unpack a little bit that pathway to peace. In 1995, there was both a military and a political stalemate, and that led to the 1996 Abidjan Peace Accord, which collapsed, and there was a return to fighting. And then there was eventually the 1999 Lomé Peace Accord. Can you walk us through initially, how did the Lomé Peace Accord come about? And the follow-on question will be for some of the details in the Lomé Peace Accord. But what was the pathway to Lomé, pathway to peace?
Basically, by 1995, there was a lot of pressure. Particularly, it was particularly from the ICRC and NGOs that people, there were these amputations, villages were being attacked, people were suffering, so there was pressure then for peace talks to happen. But in between then, the negotiations in Abidjan, I'll go to that, then I'll go back. It was conducted in good faith. It was not conducted in good faith. For instance, a letter from Sanko to the Libyan government, which was discovered later, after the signing of the accord, requested money to buy arms it stated that Sanko had signed the accord just so as to relieve our movement of the enormous pressure of the international community, while I will use this opportunity to transact my business in getting fighting materials freely and easily. So when he went to Abidjan, he didn't have any intention to end the war. He was only, and you wanting to use this opportunity to have some lack of pressure on him so that he could then reinforce himself. So this was it. But what happened after the incursion, actually? In 1992, there was a coup d'etat by young soldiers who they were fighting. They didn't have the equipment. They were having a hard time fighting with the rebels. So they had come to Freetown to protest about their lack of equipment. But it was interesting because the then President Momo, when he learned that they were coming, took flight. I mean, was really afraid that they were coming to stage a coup. Apparently, from what we had later, they actually just came to complain. But since he left, he had abandoned his position, they took over. And then Valentine Strasser, 26-year-old, was in charge and proclaimed himself president, and they took over power. And he was then in the league with and named Solomon Greva as his vice president. Madabio, our current president, were also part of that coup, by the way. So they then set up a government. So again, there was military rule. The military rule went on, and Nigerian military moved in 1993. They got the Nigerian military to move in 2 battalions to Lomé Airport. RUF in 1995, February, the RUF captured foreign workers, including some Italian nuns, British VSOs, and expatriate mine workers. And this again was drawing more attention to the whole war, because before it was so internal, once it started involving foreigners, international interest developed. But with all this again, there was a palace coup within the...
Another palace coup, okay.
Another palace coup, and that was when Madabio deposed Strasser and then became head of state. By then, there was a push by the international community for elections, and he claimed that he had deposed Strasser because Strasser wanted to hold on to military power, and he was supporting the elections to change to civilian rule. Okay, so elections did take place in January and March of 1996, and Kabab was elected president. And he was keen to accelerate talks with the RUF and had meetings with the RUF, facilitated for the most part by the ICRC. In 1997, according to the Abidjan Peace Accords, the government had employed mercenaries, the executive outcomes. But according to the Abidjan Peace Accords, they agreed that they would relieve the executive outcomes, the mercenaries. So this was done. But then there was the Civil Defense Force, because many people of the areas in which the conflict was going on, they formed themselves into a Civil Defense Force, locally known as Kamajors. So then they were fighting together, the RUF against the RUF. They were making great progress, and so in February of 1997, Fode Sanko fled to Côte d'Ivoire and was arrested and held under surveillance at the Sheraton Hotel. Then, in May of that same year, there was another coup d'etat.
Yeah.
Another coup d'etat when Johnny Paul Koroma took over power, and he said that because by then, Fode Sanko was in Abidjan under arrest in Sheraton Hotel, but he claimed that Fode Sanko was the ideological leader of his coup d'etat. And he then took over power and invited the RUF to join the government. again, we had this situation where we had a junta that was led by military plus, and they had invited the rebels to join them. So again, by February of 1998, there was a Nigerian-based offensive which caused Jody Paul Kuruma himself to flee. And so by February 1998, he had left, and the president was brought back. He had been in exile, and he was brought back to Freetown. But what happened that was significant is that in January 6th, we also have a J6 in Sierra Leone. January 6th.
Oh, yeah.
In January 6, 1999, the RUF launched a major attack on Freetown. And this was really a major attack. They burnt down a lot of the center of Freetown was completely burned down. They killed 5,000 people. They amputated 1,000 people. And it was thanks to ECOMOG, because there's a bridge which links the main Sierra Leone to the western area, which had all the elites and whatever. And it was the ECOMOG that fought nail and tooth that actually defeated the rebels and prevented them from crossing that bridge. So that made a difference, because they were able to repel the rebels and after that January 6th attack. But then also by July, that attack, of course, drew a lot of international attention because it was bloody, it was brutal. And I think there was a film which was done, a documentary which was done by Sierra Leonean journalists, which was called Cry Freetown. This was broadcast by BBC and everybody. And that again put a lot of international attention. And so pressure was put on everybody to say, we need to go back and address this peace agreement. This was how the Lomé peace talk started. And also it started to address indeed this situation that had deteriorated so much in Sierra Leone, and the international community could no longer close its eyes to what was happening. So they put a lot of pressure, and that led to the Lomé peace talks.
Well, that sounds like a very torturous path to get to the peace talks. When they kicked off the Lomé peace talks, they had a blueprint because they had the Abidjan earlier agreement. But what were some of the key elements of the Lomé agreement in terms of the power sharing, in terms of granting Fonseca the vice president position, in charge of the diamond exchange, human rights? What was in the Lomé agreement that was important?
You see, by the time it came to Lomé, Fode Sanko has realized that he was losing ground. And what he wanted, but he didn't want to come out without anything from the agreement. He knew that they had committed such atrocities that cases against them could actually condemn them, to imprisonment, etc. So they used the opportunity, because everybody was at that point was so keen to have the peace. In Sierra Leone, the population were tired with these atrocities. They would have done anything because all they wanted was to have peace. The country had been under these atrocities by the RUF, and nobody knew what. The attacks on Freetown were such that people became helpless, because Freetown is just at the end of the peninsula, and the only thing that could happen, people could not run from Freetown anywhere except jump into the ocean, and that was basically, so people would have, before the Lomé Peace Accord, if you had spoken to the ordinary Sierra Leonean, they would have said to you, look, we just want peace. We've had enough of this fighting. Let us have peace. So I think Fode Sanko capitalized on that and got, first of all, he wanted a lot of things, but he didn't get all what he wanted. But he got agreement as to the amnesty, because, first of all, the key provisions were, first, an immediate ceasefire. Then he wanted to have a transitional government, a national unity government, as it was called, with the RUF holding cabinet positions. And then the amnesty, blanket amnesty for RUF fighters, combatants. Then there was also provision for disarmament and reintegration of combatants into civil society. And there was agreement to form a commission for the consolidation of peace, a body that would monitor and verify the implementation of the accord. So basically, these were the key provisions that came out of the agreement.
Let's talk a little bit about the gender protections and gender provisions. Were there any? Was this a central element of the Lomé Accords? If not, why not? And what were the consequences of that?
Yeah. There was no provision as such for measures to ensure women's participation in decision-making processes. The Lomé agreement mentioned, basically, the way they addressed the whole gender issue, for me, was quite unsatisfactory, because it is true that women needed special attention, but the focus there was on special attention for women's economic role in reconstruction efforts. And there are initiatives to enable women to access land and microcredit programs. But it did not address the whole question of the involvement of women in decision-making as such.
So they weren't involved to any significant degree in the negotiation of the Lomé Accords, and the Accords didn't provide for gender.
They sent very powerful delegation to Lomé, but they were not part of the negotiation process. They hoped to influence the negotiators, but the result they got was not as satisfactory as they would have liked it to be.
Okay. And what lessons or recommendations do you have for future peace processes? Not just Sierra Leone, but more given the lessons learned about gender exclusion in the Lomé process.
Yeah. I think it is vital that women are involved in these negotiations. It's amazing how women and men live together, but women see things that are much more practical and to the point than men do. I have experience interviewing refugees in refugee camps, and you're asking for needs. The men would be talking about what they wanted. They wanted the radio set. They wanted, but the women would always say, "Why, I want health for my children. I want this." The women always have the down-to-earth approach. It is very important, therefore, that in peace negotiation, women are given an active role, not just as observers in the corridors, but as sitting at the negotiation table and making the points which the men normally fail to bring up.
Let's pick up a little bit more on amnesty, and I'm curious for your views on this. This Sierra Leone, the Lomé Accords were at a point in time where we were seeing a tribunal for Yugoslavia, a tribunal for Rwanda, but for decades, if not centuries before, amnesty was what you'd have in a peace agreement. In the Angola Accords, the Mozambique Accords, you name it, there's an amnesty provision. Sierra Leone was at a time where that was being rethought to a degree. What was your perspective on the necessity of and the utility of the amnesty provision in the Lomé Accords?
Yeah. I think there are many complex issues related to this. First of all, the political and military realities. The government was militarily weak, and they were faced with significant pressure from the RUF, and they knew that, they were weak militarily. And also because of all these goals, background, all these things that were happening, were not boarding together to give confidence in the government. Basically, they were more inclined, because it was the vice president who went, and he was more inclined, of Sierra Leone, was more inclined to accept this amnesty in the interest of having peace. Because, as I said, people were saying, look, we just want to have peace now, And, the amnesty became a necessary compromise to the peace. It became a necessary compromise in the face of the weak, militarily weak government. And also, that people were, the whole population, they all wanted these negotiations to go on. It didn't seem as if it was likely to go on to yield any results unless the amnesty was granted to earlier fighters. So I think it was a compromise which was made. And these issues actually highlight the delicate balance between achieving peace and ensuring justice in post-conflict situations. It is a delicate balance, especially in the case of Sierra Leone, where there are so many things happening, so many actors, so many people wanting to jump in. And the government felt that by doing this, they could see their way forward.
So a necessary condition to get signatures on the Lomé.
Yes. So getting signatures on the Lomé Convention, yes.
Now one of the micro stories of the Lomé Convention is the signature of the UN representative. The UN representative signed as a witness or a guarantor, and then penned in a little comment next to the signature saying this does not apply to a UN enforcement of the amnesty. It's a little quirky, but what are your thoughts on the UN position on that sort of penciling in?
Yeah. No, I think at one point he was instructed not to sign it, but he realized that so he wasn't going to be popular by not signing it. After all, also, the UN had not been very active in looking for a solution for the war. They had sat on the sidelines. I remember once we were attending a meeting in Cote d'Ivoire, and the then USG for Political Affairs was a Sierra Leonean, James Jonah. And in that meeting, I said, I'm always, I don't understand. They were saying, this is a war which requires regional solution. And I said to him, I challenged him at that meeting, I said, but excuse me, the UN has the ultimate responsibility for peace. I think the UN is shirking its responsibility. Of course, he didn't like it. I wasn't very popular. But I said that to his face. But again, the UN representative had to say, look, if I don't sign this, there's going to be no peace accord. And so he was forced to put the UN position in writing. But you ask about my own feeling. I remember feeling extremely unhappy about the amnesty. But there seemed to be the only way out at the time. And I was asked by the same UN, by the same people for political affairs in the UN to say, I said, I'm against it. He said, yeah, but what are you going to do? I mean, do you want peace or, So I had to. But I must say, I felt so badly because I had known all the atrocities that were committed by Allied fighters. And we thought that they were to just go away, get away with it. Really made me feel extremely unhappy. But even more, what made me feel very unhappy is that, after the agreement was signed and Fode Sanko had his triumphant entry to Freetown, I was watching the TV and I almost broke my TV set. It was dressed in white, immaculate white, waving. So I said, this guy had caused so much mistake, and here he was coming triumphantly, given the role to control the whole mineral resources. That was where it was like putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank. There he was, and to begin, and actually he wasn't called vice president, but it was de facto because he was only reporting to. It was supposed to only report to the president, and there he was waving. And believe me, the way I felt at the time, I couldn't say it. But everybody said to me, okay, let's have peace. Let's have peace. And so anyway, this was the way I felt. The blanket amnesty was, I personally was not happy with it. But the people in Sierra Leone that anything to end the war would be okay with us. And they weren't going to do anything about it. And Fode Sanko came in, triumphantly into Freetown. But of course, that made him have more greater ambitions. And this was what led eventually to his downfall.
That I was going to ask about that because it was, the amnesty and other concessions were a trade-off in the
Yeah.
Lomé agreement for peace.
Mhm.
Did the Lomé agreement actually bring about peace in Sierra Leone?
No, it did not directly bring about peace in Sierra Leone, because what happened was that Fode Sankoh was given so much, but he was not to be trusted. His fighters refused to disarm. They would not even allow the UN peacekeepers to go to their areas. The fearing, and then things came to a head when when they were continuing. The RAF was continuing. They refused to disarm. They were continuing with their atrocities. So it was in 2000. In 2000, when there was big demonstrations in Freetown, people came up, big demonstrations, and the demonstration actually led to the arrest of Fode Sankoh. And so he was arrested, and he was in prison. And then, by then they had asked for, in fact, since 2000, and the Syrian government had asked for the creation of a special court. And this dragged on because even though the resolution was passed by the Security Council in 2000 and approval was given for the court, there were delays because in terms of raising the funds for the work of the court, it came to like 58 million. It was estimated, and it took a long time to raise enough funds even to set up the court.
Well, I bet this was an interesting turn of events. There was the Yugoslav tribunal in The Hague, the Rwanda tribunal in first The Hague, and then Arusha. This was the first hybrid tribunal created for a conflict or almost post-conflict situation where it had international prosecutors, judges, but also Sierra Leonean prosecutors and judges and defense counsel. And one of the first things it did was to indict Fonseca, as well as the representative, the former minister of defense, who had been in charge of organizing the civilian defense forces. How did that play out? You have Lomé, an amnesty-based peace agreement on one end of the spectrum, then all the way to the other end of the spectrum with a hybrid or an internationalized tribunal, which immediately indicted, the top 12 suspects from all the various sides of the conflict. Walk us through that time and space.
Yeah, okay. The interesting thing about how it all evolved is that because the court was a hybrid court, they brought up the point that amnesty applied in Sierra Leone did not necessarily apply to an international body. So this hybrid nature was what was used to argue in favor of indicting some of the suspects, some of the people involved in the war, because they claimed this is not a Sierra Leonean court, which was according to the agreement was to respect the amnesty. This is a hybrid court; it's an international component, and crimes committed. I mean, international and amnesty given by a particular country should not apply to an international court. So they use this hybrid nature of the court to justify bringing some of these people to justice.
I remember the defense counsel, their exhibit A for the defense counsel was the Lomé Accords. And they said, look, right here in this article, we have amnesty. And David Crane, the prosecutor, argued, and the judges agreed. It's like, sure, you have amnesty for domestic crimes.
Yeah.
Or an internationalized tribunal, you can't amnesty for atrocity crimes. There's a pretty marked shift in the role of justice in peace processes.
What?
Very impactful that the tribunal did is the tribunal was the first tribunal to focus on gender-based crimes. Because the lawyers who listen to this podcast know that one of the flaws of the framework for prosecuting atrocity crimes is that there aren't specific provisions for gender-based crimes. You usually attach them to other crimes. The prosecutor was very clever in approaching this notion of bushwives because it dealt with sexual and gender-based violence. Walk us through a little bit about your response and thinking on the tribunal and why and how it moved into the space of
Mhm.
prosecuting gender-based crimes, which, as we mentioned, were sort of ignored in the Lomé agreement.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
could, bringing talk to us.
yeah. No, I mean, very interesting. I think the Special Court for Sierra Leone set a number of precedences for in international law. First of all, and jurisprudence. First of all, they for the first time they rendered an important decision on, first of all, on the first one we covered, on the validity of amnesties in international law. That was something which was new, I imagine. Then the special court prosecuted persons for the conscription enlistment of child soldiers. This was again a first. It also, for the first time, actually prosecuted people for forced marriage,
Yes.
gender-based violence, including forced marriages. And this led to the first ever convictions of forced marriage as a crime against humanity, and falling within the ambit of other inhumane acts. So they were able to put this within the ambit of other inhumane acts. So the court, I must say, the court was very progressive in regard to some of these precedences, which I think created a precedence generally. Yeah? And also, the special court was the first to try and convict persons for attacks directed against United Nations peacekeepers.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yes. And also, it was the first time since Nuremberg that trial proceedings against a former head of state were successfully initiated and completed. So really, the Special Court for Sierra Leone did come out with a lot of precedents and jurisdiction and jurisprudence. Again, although in the end there are 12 convicted people, their work, and they also concluded their work.
Unlike many of the other tribunals who are still ongoing at this point in time.
Were able to conclude their work here, and that's like other tribunas. So we have to give some kind of recognition for the Special Sierra Leone Court. Hybrid, it was hybrid, first hybrid court, and it was able to do all this.
It brought the gender-based crimes to the forefront. The first, former head of state Charles Taylor, who's now still serving time as we speak in a high security prison north of London, and that led, I think, to the pathway for indicting Bashir, Milosevic, Putin, Netanyahu, and it was that Sierra Leone tribunal, the mix of international and domestic, that really happened. They also did something interesting. They paired it with the Truth Commission. And if I remember correctly, the Truth Commission was in the same building as the tribunal. And so the tribunal was tasked with going after, those most responsible for the most serious crimes.
Yes. Okay.
And then the Truth Commission was the forum for the victims to tell their story. Can you talk to us a little bit about, did that work? Is that a model for other conflicts?
Yeah. Actually, it worked quite well. I mean, first of all, the TRC focused on uncovering the truth about conflict, promoting reconciliation, and providing a platform for victims to come and share their stories. It was interesting because the Sierra Leone Civil War was not an ethnic war. It was not a religious war. It was purely, and this is why I come to it, purely out of greed to capture the diamonds at the diamond areas. As far as my assessment of it goes, it was interesting that in the Sierra Leone war, in families, one brother was fighting with the RUF, the other brother was in the government. So it's cut across everything. This was why, for me, in my opinion, it was easy to have the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, because in some cases it was just reuniting families. The brother had, and if you look at, there is a war memorial in Freetown, and it illustrated quite well that some people came back to the village and was apologizing for what they did in that village. So it worked quite well. Again, as you said, to come back to the link with the special court, the special court, on the other hand, aimed, of course, it was to prosecute those with the highest, those bearing the greatest responsibility for the serious violations. They did not do the violations themselves, so they had other people, but they were responsible because they instigated it. There was significant emphasis on cooperation and information sharing between the two institutions. The TRC provided valuable information that could be used in the court's prosecutions, while the court findings could also inform the TRC's work. There was a lot of cooperation between them. And there were protective measures to ensure the safety of witnesses and victims. Protective measures were put in place when sharing information between the TRC and the special court. And there was mutual respect. Both institutions operated with mutual respect for each other's work. So there was no, thinking that what one was doing was against the other. That mutual respect also, the TRC, of course, focused on broader historical record and reconciliation, while the special courts concentrated on legal accountability. The efforts were collaborative, and a lot of effort was made to prevent duplication of the work and maximize the use of the limited resources which were available to both bodies. And this really worked quite very well.
I think as you mentioned, the mutual respect was important, especially in light of the scarce resources. We've seen in other contexts, Yugoslavia and other places, where there's competition with commissions and tribunals over these scarce resources. And the victims are looking and saying, well, wait a second, shouldn't this be victim-centered? Shouldn't we be asking us rather than the internationals, so to speak, competing for resources? Well, let me ask you your thoughts on balancing justice and peace. Sierra Leone had the amnesty, and then it had the failed Lomé agreement, and then it had the tribunal, and now it's democratic. It's on a path towards peace and prosperity. Are there lessons learned from Sierra Leone in terms of this tension between peace versus justice that you think are applicable to other conflicts? We see Ukraine, we see Gaza, we see Yemen, Sudan. What should young professionals and mid-career professionals who are thinking about this dynamic, what can they learn from Sierra Leone?
Let me say that basically the balance between peace and justice, they will always have these two things, and people will be looking at both and trying to balance them out. The interesting thing about this is that whereas people wanted immediate peace, the justice, the accountability takes time. It takes time. And when I was in New York, it was interesting. It takes time. And again, and then the rehabilitation too is extremely important. Unless people see that the efforts are there, they are bound to question why the concentration is on the justice side. I tell you a story which was interesting. I was director for Africa in DESA at the time. And a Sierra Leone delegation in New York said they wanted to come and see me. So, of course, they didn't know what powers I had. I had nothing to do with it. So I came. I welcomed them. And then they said, the spokesman said, you are director here, and we just want to plead with you. Said, the monies that are spent on the court, we realize that if for the first year, $20 million have been spent in the court, could that money be assigned to us for reconstruction? And I said, I really, the way they were feeling, because they said the war had ended, the rehabilitation efforts were not being funded, and there was this court that was going to cost $56 million. And for them, it's just like they could ask me if I could ask that money that they forget about the court, even though people had committed the atrocities, etc. But people were really willing to say, look, and also the patience they don't have to wait until the judgment comes. If indeed the other needs are not being taken into account, they can, say, okay, you concentrate on the legal processes and what happens to us in the meantime.
There's that the competition of resources and the
resources was something which also influenced people's thinking about the court, its work. Definitely the resources, availability of resources. Because meanwhile, they had done the they had done the demobilization, etc., etc. But the part of it all that received very little focus was the rehabilitation needs. They were not there. And people who were all so enthusiastic, end of war. And then that was the way they looked at the efforts at the legal, at the work of the court, even though they realized that was important. Another thing too, which I must say in the Sierra Leone case, is that, many of the ringleaders of the atrocities and the coup and all, they all died in the process. I say this was retributive justice. I believe that. Because I tell you why. 42nd died. The Solomon, no, it was called Solomon. What was it? It was the head of the military wing of RUF, and he was nicknamed Mosquito. It was killed in Liberia. It was claimed to have been killed by an attempt to arrest him in Liberia. He was killed in that. Johnny Paul Koroma, who had staged the other coup that had tried to bring RUF back into power, and had tried to bring RUF into government within, he disappeared. No trace was heard of him. So the very big people in the whole contributors to the war, they were no longer to stand trial. Of course, there was Charles Taylor, but it took so long that by the time Charles Taylor got his conviction, people said forgotten about the war.
It had moved on to
yeah. So basically, the court have tried to conclude its proceedings and sentenced people, and of course, 6 of them were sentenced to between 25 and 52 years in prison. Charles Taylor, of course, got 50 years, and 3 AFRC and 3 RUF, they got judged between 25 to 50 years, which they are serving in Rwanda. One person has since been released and was accepted back in his community with the promise of good conduct. And of course, the others died.
Yvette, do you believe that this tribunal had an impact on lasting peace in Sierra Leone? Looking back with hindsight, it's like,
yeah,
it played a substantial role in securing lasting peace, or no, not so.
I think a survey was done. I think people did say that they believe that it did. It did have an impact. Yeah. So according to the survey which was done, the people did feel that it had an impact, although on peace in Sierra Leone, because at least one thing that was important is that even though it took some time, that it did act as a deterrent for impunity. And people realized that whatever successful you might be, at one point in the day, you can be held to account for whatever actions you have done. And you would not be, there would be no impunity. So I think in that respect, right now, people do fear that whatever you do, if at the end of the day you could be convicted for it and you could face the force of the law. So yes, I was looking for some examples I had of the surveys that were done, but it came out almost 80 to 90% of the population did believe that it helped to address impunity from any would-be offenders.
So it deters future offenders. It reestablishes the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
Yvette, you've been very generous with your time. I have one last question. What are the key takeaways from your life experience? Many of our listeners are young professionals, mid-career professionals who are engaged or will be engaged in human rights, peace building, negotiation, mediation, justice. What do you want them to know and to remember in terms of the lessons that you've learned, seeking to promote human rights, seeking for gender inclusion, women's empowerment, mediation of conflict?
Mm-hmm. I would like them to know that, in fact, human rights is extremely important in terms of ensuring lasting peace. And when I retired from the UN, I was asked by the president of the Human Rights Council to look at ways in which the council could enhance its role in preventing human rights violations. We came into the concept of different parts of the process of prevention, what we call prevention process. The first prevention role is that basically many of these conflicts emerge after years of human rights violations. And we, as the international community, the system we have in place is that we sit down, we listen, we hear of all this happening, and the only time we act is when the genie is out of the bottle and the conflict has started. So the first thing I would say is that concentration on human rights, on implementation of human rights commitments, of human rights, every country should really place a lot of emphasis on that. And anybody who's working in terms of enhance in efforts at peace should start not when the fighting starts, but should start actually from countries where, and looking at the human rights record. And it is very interesting that the Human Rights Council has a mechanism, the Universal Periodic Review. The Universal Periodic Review is good, and people say there are too many recommendations. I say that when you look at the results of the Universal Periodic Review, the recommendations, the group of recommendations actually reflect the human rights situation in a particular country. And basically, we do not, the countries come, they take the recommendations, they go back, and then they come back 3 years later, the same recommendations are made to them. And my point then was to say, the Human Rights Council itself and those interested in human rights should actually have an interest in seeing why the accepted recommendations are not being implemented. And this is where you would find that sometimes it is not because of a lack of willingness to implement them, but it's the lack of means, not only means and not financial means, but also the capacity, not only the financial capacity, but to implement them. I got experience on that myself when I was ambassador, that after the Universal Periodic Review to my country, I sat down and I wrote all the needs that we required to implement the accepted recommendations, which I sent to the OHCHR. I never got any response. And I said to that, and realized that the budget that the OHCHR has for implementation of Universal Periodic Review recommendations was something like $1.5 million.
Yeah.
So you see, I have since been fighting both. Now I'm out, so I don't have such a strong voice. But I've been working. I am now a member of the board of the Universal Rights Group. And we have been fighting to say, this is an important thing which needs to be done. We have to look at the human rights record in a country, see why the recommendations are not being implemented, provide assistance where required, and that way we can actually help we're not going to eliminate, in conflicts, because basically when, in some cases this would be beyond us, but at least we would have tried to address the human rights violations, which could eventually lead to conflict. And so also, the other thing I came out of from that is that, the Human Rights Council itself should have a means of bringing together all the information that is coming. We hear in the news, the NGOs, Amnesty International, they're all giving the signals that things are going wrong in the country. And the council itself will wait until, as I said, when it starts going bad, and with a special session. So our recommendation was that the council, the OHCHR should enforce a unit it has to actually analyze situations. And when they see that the situations are really getting bad and could lead to a conflict, to draw the attention of the Human Rights Council. And then there could be things which are not being done. There could be right at the moment, and I hope they're still bouncing around with these recommendations, that they could, first of all, engage the governments. Confidentiality is important, even though the NGOs will tell them, no, it should not be confidential. But I tell you, sometimes it works when it's confidential, because when you get to the special session and the government back is put against the wall, it resists it, it has its friends come around, and then even though the Human Rights Council comes out with, all the special rapporteur for the situation, all what they come out with later, if the government is not cooperative, it doesn't work so well. So it's better to prevent, to make sure that if indeed some of these conflicts could be prevented before they actually blow out, whatever the Human Rights Council could do would be positive. So again, briefly, the two main things was that assist governments in implementing the recommendations that they have. And then secondly, take urgent action, take early action to approach governments and see if that would not resolve a pending situation of conflict.
Act early and often to protect human rights and avoid. And you can always have a tribunal at the end.
Yeah. But as I said, the commissions of inquiry go, but they are not allowed access. They have to start. And then I question sometimes with the commissions of inquiry to also say, if whatever they have collected, would it stand in a court of law? So anyway, so that's my own thinking, to say that it's better to prevent. It's better to do the maximum to prevent it before it occurs. Of course, some would occur anyway, but at least the international community would have done, and the human rights body would have done a bit more in terms of preventing these situations leading to conflicts.
And then that creates much more stable peace. Well, Yvette, thank you for sharing your thoughts and your ideas. You've made me incredibly smart on Sierra Leone now, and our listeners as well. You're multidimensional, thinking in terms of the origins of the conflict, the negotiations, balancing peace versus justice, protecting gender rights, and including women in the peace process. It's been really fantastic. It's been an honor and a privilege to have this conversation with you and to work with you these past few years as a senior peace fellow at PILPG. So thank you very much for all that you've done and all that you continue to do to make the world a more peaceful place.
And thank you for all the work you're doing in terms of addressing peace in the world. I really appreciate all the work you're doing too. So thank you.